Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another SixyTimes Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. Ooh, we are laggy. Why are we laggy? Oh, looks like it was temporary. The internet is slowly degrading these days, but we'll get there. Either way, at the moment, the spectate function does not seem to have worked for our stream station, so we're gonna have a match without that, but that just gives me more time to talk. Today we are obviously playing Dead or Alive 6, and we were gonna have some discussions about offense and the equivalent of jumping in, and then I decided not to do that because there is none, so we won't talk about it. Not only is there none, there's no equivalent. And that's one of the things you actually have to learn fairly early in these games. You'd think, well, this is it, or this is good luck. You're probably wrong. Just straight up. Or rather, it's an oversimplistic perspective to take, and that's about all I'm going to say about it. This week, therefore, we're going to be moving into the concept of how to get offense in a game where your opponent's aim is to make you stand at a space where your options are limited. That's basically neutral. Whether or not the character is benefiting from a long range, from buttons that get them through attacks that would stop them, or from playing defensively enough that you as the other player need to come to them even when you have longer range moves of your own, because this can work. Neutral in these games is often about movement, but the movement is heavily based on distraction a lot of the time. At the end of the day, faster moves have more counters. The end. They are shorter range, so you can't do them from as far away. They usually don't hit standing, the fastest ones. Or rather, they don't hit crouching. So if you just crouch a little bit, or even dash crouch in, you'll go under them. This is not usually a thing that comes up, but, you know. One of the main reasons that's meaningful is because the longer ones that are mids are therefore really telegraphed, because since you could avoid all of the high ones if you had a execution for it, then the whole system in this game means, oh, you can just expect that it's going to be that way and deal with it. At least they made it a little difficult now because you have the 4-way hold. But we do seem to have some issues with connection today. We'll see if there's something we can do to resolve it on this side, if there's anything to be done at all or needs to be done. You can expect most of the speech about today's stream to be related to more so to how to fake your opponent into thinking that you want to use a specific attack when you don't. And given that what I've just seen on this side of the stream is definitely something over here, so we'll go look into that for now, see if there's anything going on in the internet that we can easily find. There's only a certain amount of stuff you can do without specifically ending the lounge, and therefore not necessarily the stream overall, but at least temporarily. So if we don't find anything that we can easily fix, you know, the usual something off with the router in some way that is not fully terrible, something being downloaded, blah blah. But we'll be back in a moment in terms of voice while we're dealing with that.
I cannot lose this fight. This is the melody.
Alright, maybe we've resolved our flux, but we're not going to necessarily know right away because we're no longer playing from the side. Last week we discussed the general tendency of Bayman and Honoka. One of the problems Bayman has as a generality is that when most characters get really close, they get to stay plus, since Bayman's moves tend to be slower. Now, throws are a good solution to this sometimes, but you have to believe that there will be some form of break in the attack string, or you have some way of convincing your opponent that there should be one. The obvious solution to an opponent who continually does pressure strings and ends up at advantage is to hold. But since high holds and mid holds are different for punches, and characters that have good pressure tend to have good flows between the two of them, you can't always do this. This is further complicated by the fact that when there is a break, Honoka has at least two options for her own throws that can be real problems, and one that goes through a ton of other things, including Baymon's holds. Better resolution to this from Baymon's side is actually to make sure that when he does hit things to get out of pressure, it's usually a low, which he only has like two of that matter in that specific situation. But do remember that this game does include what we will call high and low crush, and to some extent even moves that will duck almost entirely under mid attacks. Because not all mid attacks are exactly the same hitbox. There's the property of the move, and then there's the actual height of the move. And this can matter. Last time it was suggested to the Wolf to use more sweep. And sweep is a good solution to a lot of problems Baymon has in the neutral in a lot of pressury matchups. But not necessarily because it's a great idea to hit consistently. Sweep is slow to start extremely, and gets beat by a lot of things, but also gets out of a lot of pressure strings if you're really consistent about it. It is your main tool for keeping the opponent who has gotten into a scramble from wanting to approach, because it's actually fairly hard to punish as a move. It isn't too hard to hold it, but if you've made your opponent think about the fact that they might need to hold a sweep, then they probably have increased the amount of thinking they have to do as a generality and are not necessarily thinking about keeping up the pressure as heavily. But since strikes beat throws in this game, it's very difficult for Baymon to wiggle around in neutral and then decide, okay, I'm going for throw, because if the opponent decides to go for a hit at that point, problems will come up. Alright, as noted, we probably found the culprit. There's always something like that. So with presumably a smoother game now, we will have some discussion about the Helena side of this. Helena as a character is strong in this situation because she has a lot of moves that have deceptively far forward hitboxes. She has a lot of space she can take up, and deceptively far forward hitboxes help at the beginner-ish level because the opponent is usually thinking, okay, I don't remember seeing any moves that hit me from there. So they go for an attack, and they do get hit. Now, why they get hit isn't always clear, which helps out. One of the good things for the Helena player, but harder things to learn, is you don't really have to use the moves that she seems to have the longest range on. A lot of her moves that seem to have closer ranges, especially kicks, will usually hit beyond where you somewhat expect them to. There's a little momentum in how she moves, and she just has hitboxes that seem to go beyond what is standard for fighting games, not necessarily what is standard for fighting. Coming from 2D games, this is where it actually does matter. It's often true that a character's actual strike zone isn't like right out to the tip of their toes on their attack. You get a small whiff space for some reason. Mainly, I guess, is because balance would really not work well if characters had the amount of reach they did, and it's semi-realistic because if you don't hit with at least like your ankle, most of the time you didn't actually do any damage. The tip of your toes tapping someone's toes does not result in them being stunned long enough for you to land another move. You need the part of your body that can put force behind it to actually do something, but Helena, for various reasons, mostly the swinginess of many of her attacks, or the fact that they don't take all of their force forward, they're sharp, basically. It's literally in the description of her style. You end up being able to stand a little bit further out than you'd expect. The same goes for her throws, actually. She's very, very good at reaching relative to the expectation of the player. Meaning that most of the time she doesn't want to end up close enough for this to even matter. She doesn't have to. The feeling that you don't have enough control over the space is, for this character, mostly an illusion, and you should try when you can and learn where you whiff rather than actually relying on moves that definitely look like they'll hit. It's counterintuitive, but you still have to try because not every character in DoA does this. Again, this has a lot to do with the way they model the martial arts portion. And the more realistic martial arts tend to be closer to this side. Because the more realistic the martial art, the more grounded in reality the actual delivery of the force tends to be. But since human bodies somewhat pull back or recoil automatically after expending a lot of force, and because the game doesn't want to be the type of game where throwing a punch means that you might fail your own follow-through, you can think of it multiple ways, but it works out.
I'm kidding, that's all I got.
Are you here to take me out? You like pain?
But as just demonstrated, at a certain other range, Bayman does have a different low he can use. He does have a punching one. It's just that the punching one has a different purpose. It is to attack from far as a low without bringing him into the space that would lead to the opponent's closer mid-hits working. So he has one for I'm going under your attack because we're close, and one for I am coming through your attack because we're far. These sort of things come up in 3D games a lot. As a character, he's generally effective by avoiding a space like that. People don't end up going in any particular direction because of anything Bayman does. They go based on what they want to do. But they attack often based on where Bayman is placed.
Is that all you got? Come back when you're strong enough to matter.
As always, bear in mind when joining that this is a US East Coast or technically Atlantic Rim lobby. If you have really good internet, you can try from the Midwest side of the US, or you can try from a little further into Europe. That's probably fine. Michi is a character we have not seen on stream before more than once, probably. Fortunately, she's not a terribly difficult character to understand, except in the sense that her strings basically never stop. Which is required because she's actually, for a ninja character, relatively slow and kind of straightforward in neutral. At least at the beginner level, she's mostly straightforward and neutral. As far as I know, this does in fact extend as you get higher as well, but you never know what top players will come up with. They'll do crazy things. Top player doesn't always look the same. This is because so many of her moves have long start moments where it's just, okay, I think I can move in now. But you see what I mean here. There's a slow point at which she hasn't really extended her attack range yet. So she's good at standing just outside your range and interrupting what you do. It's hard to explain it. Unfortunately for all this, she also doesn't do a whole lot of damage. She's just really confusing when you are hitting with strings. She's good for Kasumi players who like a specific aspect of Kasumi that you don't get from phase 4, you go in the other direction. But it also means that one of your better options is to just block for a really long time. She's another one of those characters that tends to push you out eventually. She does not have to do this. Eventually her strings will normally knock you out, but she's not obligated to. However, as always, she has less strings that don't knock you out away from her, and therefore these are more predictable and easier to hold. But blocking is extremely important. Understanding that her damage isn't high is also very important. And knowing that you need to counterattack with different things is probably the most important. That's going to be the biggest difficulty for most players going up against Momichi at the beginning, because it's, I have to block basically forever, and as soon as she gives you an opportunity to actually counterattack, if you give in to your instinct and just hit the fastest button, or the strongest one, or just the easiest one to hit, the player probably learns quickly what that is and holds it instead. From the Momichi side, therefore, you can see some good use here of the backflips that tend to make the opponent kind of annoyed. They have exactly that effect that sidestepping would have, and deals with her not so great movement. And as you can see there, the backflip, like nearly every other move she has a kind of delayed effect. You think it's okay, well, the hitbox must be gone, and then it isn't.
I don't have time to play games with you. All right. I will do my best.
It's hard once you've started to play a character a particular way to experiment with too many other of their moves. And in Helena's case, it's specifically that so many of her moves are obvious that her less obvious ones just don't get a lot of attention. Why use shorter moves when you have long ones? It's mostly because the longer ones leave your opponent at advantage if you whiff them enough that you're going to get hit with like a full combo by most characters. And since those are the ones that have the less deceptive ranges, the opponent easily learns how to move into the correct spacings to avoid them, as well as the fact that in general the moves are not super good for keeping people who are trying to get in the way Bayman does, for example, from doing so. And her other moves are relatively telegraphed, so people with faster moves tend to knock her out of them. This results in Helena inching forward, trying to get to a space, and the opponent basically countering it a lot. From the other side, the player actually defending only cares a little bit about the speed. Like, they can see, well, I did this and I wasn't fast enough. And unfortunately, when your opponent can see too easily where they're going wrong, where they're not executing fast enough, where they're not reacting fast enough, they'll not only keep on trying to do this, they'll slowly get better and better at it. This might be what you want, depending on your goal in the matchup for, that day. If you're fighting with your friends and you want them to get better at it. But it's definitely not the greatest thing to happen in a long-term strategy because, obviously, you slowly become less capable of winning the match.
You, huh? Fine.
I cannot lose this fight.
These two seem to meet here often. This is another problem for Helena in general. Characters like Momiji and to some extent Bayman who go into an attack but the actual timing of the attack is very delayed, cause her to whiff her moves while still getting hit by their attack. And because throws don't resolve this, they have reasonably good defense against the throw part. Obviously players in this game have had time to get used to whiff punishing Helena. And it was partially because we knew that was going to happen eventually, that this particular stream takes on this tone. However, fortunately our Helena player is one of those players who learns in those situations where the opponent has learned to counter something and they just move on to the next thing. On both sides, that is. Understanding that you're that sort of player can also change and help with your expectations in certain situations, namely tournaments. As the tournament performance of this player type tends to be very binary. Complete dominance in matchups they understand or against player styles they know, and complete shutdown by anyone who adapts to them or whose style is unfamiliar enough but still effective. Basically, if you know the matchup too well, and the player has never been exposed to someone that knows the matchup that well, adapting midway is a little harder. Willingness to do it, though, is almost always there. Meaning that gathering information and then moving forward from it tends to be relatively easy.
It is an honor. I don't have time to play
Ooh,
games.
training room. Haven't seen this in forever. For this situation, it's actually relatively easier for Helena because Momiji's moves have that long wind-up, Helena's multi-hits and other things work way better. The main problem will therefore be, as we mentioned before, the blocking and the results of being frustrated by having to block for so long. Since Momiji as a character doesn't tend to need to be predicted, you either avoid her moves or hold them, which is another thing that helps. Knowing the startup for a move and being able to react to it in time is hard for most characters, against most characters, but Momiji tends to be a character where this is easily possible because of the way she flows. This is not, however, a thing you actually spend much time doing, because most of the reason she does moves don't have to do with actually being in range for the moves to hit when she starts. As you can see there, most of the time Momiji is not going to hit a move because she believes she's in this range to hit with it. It's generally not optimal for her. She's hoping that you wait for her to do things so she can dash in and do better, faster moves from close range. Very effective, honestly, similar to the Ayane method of dashing up instead of using certain things. But you can definitely win out in this situation. Momiji, however, has a lot of good options for stopping her string really early and then using one of these same moves. And that's probably one of your best options as the Momiji player, stopping a string early or stopping a run-up early and using this method to keep your opponent from being able to do what they want in response to your moves all the time. From there, just get close enough to land the beginning of a string and you're set to go, basically. Because the beginning of a string is always important for the flow. The player is usually confused because against other characters, moves that Momiji uses that actually keep going on those characters represent the end of a string. If you've gotten used to that concept, then most likely what you'll do is try to counterattack. You won't keep blocking. So she's really good at opening people up when their expectations are based on the way other characters in the game work. If you see an uppercutty hand, you go, oh, well, that's probably the end. And you stop. You stop blocking, you go for the counterattack, you hope for the best. But she usually is continuing. There's one good example. That move is extremely plus. On nearly no other character in the game, doing that makes you plus enough to keep going. But here we are. Janli as a character is hard to keep up with, but not particularly hard to understand. Step 1, sidestep. Step 2, sidestep some more. So much of the neutral with this character relies on the sidestep, and the second stage is basically impossible until the sidestep is mastered, that you really don't need to know much else.
I
You can't sidestep all in one direction though, because he does have tracking moves. It's more about thinking about where you need to get out of when the situation is bad. He will generally come forward a lot, but because of the range of many of his moves, you will be able to move around certain things he does. As the placings get smaller, it gets harder. But you can imagine him more so as a character who keeps on projecting this giant wedge-like wall in front of him, and your job is just to be out of the way of the wedge. Once you've done that, you can get to the second level of the fight, which has to do with holding all of the stuff he has to use because you're sidestepping. But no, the sidestep isn't in itself meant to dodge Janli's moves. It is meant to prevent the player from wanting to use certain ones. Once you've gotten them to that point of, well, these moves are pointless, he has relatively limited mobility and instead uses strikes to advance himself toward you while making sure you can't really counterattack him. This is why you can actually see some relatively patient play here. A lot of Janli is about being somewhat of a rock. He stands there, and then when he thinks things are going to go in his direction, then he moves. And then he moves a lot. In order to stop players from preemptively moving for launching attacks that could hit you rather hard, you sidestep so that he is discouraged from making those attacks and limited to only the ones that make him move forward and create the wedge. And from there, then you can try learning to hold. This is particularly helpful because he doesn't have a lot of variation in his strings compared to other characters. He can stop them, but often the recovery time for stopping his string midway isn't that really helpful. He doesn't get a lot out of going, well, I'm done now, let me try to move to something else. And since he's not often at the range where he can just throw you as a result of this, you're still probably fine. The good thing from Janli's side is that usually, unless you have a really long range attack, you don't get a lot of damage out of this. So, swing your fists around, feel free to do that, but remember to sidestep, because otherwise you're going to start to see moves that check a lot of your options. He can get around lows, he can get around highs, he can hit you from relatively far out with mids and chain off them. All of these things are at least limited by your willingness to sidestep, and in some cases backdash, but usually not as necessary.
I'll end this quickly.
Alright, let's do this!
There you go, you can already see it. The main kicks being put in. The dancey stuff. All of these appear when the player does not use the sidestep as much. It is definitely not that you can't advance on Janli as a character. In fact, you can advance while sidestepping. And as you just saw, it tends to limit the amount of things that actually happen with his attacks. Not because he doesn't have attacks to deal with the problem of a person advancing while sidestepping, but simply because there's no way to know when they're going to stop sidestepping and start advancing. You can't judge instantly. This is one of those no commitment situations that you can't go, well, this is obviously about to happen, so I should use this move. But there's the other part coming in, as you saw. The range that Janley is able to fight at when expecting this doesn't lead to you getting a lot of confirms, combos. Most of the moves you use don't damage him much and don't lead into much. So you're gonna have to be really patient in the matchup as a result. But the straightforward approach, it works about as well as you'd expect, and the wolf calls for today. Alright, another note for those of you who are not necessarily so familiar with the way these lobbies work. There is a second slot that you can have matches in, especially if you would prefer your matches to not be streamed and not have any comment on them. You can go over there once the lounge starts to get full and have some matches. There's not going to be a lot to say here, mostly because Bayman not being terribly susceptible to Momiji's style of play is more so, it goes both ways. Bayman can't really grab her very often. He ends up getting a hold or getting beat up, and she gets the massive advantage of, we already talked about nearly every pressure character having an advantage against Bayman unless he can hold because of his relatively slower moves. She is high on the ranking list of advantage versus Bayman in close range. But she does have to get there, and it's not super easy to do. When she is in though, he's not really likely to be able to punish her once she goes for anything special or different, due to the mention of the pushback. His moves are relatively slow on that front too, so pushing herself out at the end of a string isn't something Bayman can always do much about. Similarly, when the player has realized, oh, I'm definitely about to get thrown, then they know it's time to tech the throw. So it's relatively easy to get out of it. She doesn't tend to get thrown in the sense that I'm being outright punished here for something I've done. It's, I have stopped attacking because I think it's a good idea to stop attacking here. You might throw me, and when you throw me, I'll react to the fact that you tried to throw me. There's nothing difficult about it for most players at high level, and particularly Momiji players would be more used to this than most because of the fact that she just ends up in the situation far more often than other characters. However, the wolf manages to avoid that throw, the dash up throw being a good option at that point, given the rest of the flow of the match thus far. But now you just have to deal with Momiji things. Relatively big risk there, but it still did pay off. As with most ninja characters, you can't just assume you know what Momiji's next attack will be, which is why we specifically say block instead of going straight for holds. But again, unlike characters like Kasuma and Ayane, where you know that you will get to hold if they want to trick you. If you don't just block. Momiji isn't really like this as much. So your best bet is almost always just keep blocking. In terms of balance, she therefore doesn't get as many options for dealing big damage. If she does, break your guard and get through your block and manage to hit you one way or the other. And that, what you just saw, is basically the hope. Eventually, you want the Momiji player to think, well, you're just gonna block anyway, I might as well keep doing the same combo so that I continue to B+. And then you hold that particular thing. It would be our advisement to generally not even try to hold the kick, because getting hit by the kick isn't a big enough deal. As noted before, she's a relatively low damage character, and the situation tends to shift in your favor if she's forced to kick you at long range. She does have follow-ups and confirms, but even her best damage isn't necessarily great.
Decided to join us here. It is an honor.
So we return to the discussion of how to deal with Momiji on Helena. Particularly as a Helena whose tendency is to try to get out of situations when she believes it's time to get out of them. One of the most discouraging things about fighting games is to come to the feeling or conclusion that it is never your turn. In fact, even the concept of there being turns is part of this. Because it's so easy to teach players at the very basic level, this is advantage, this is not, this is why your opponent keeps attacking. It's their turn. It comes up a lot. In games where there's chip damage or white damage, it has a stronger meaning, a much stronger meaning than here. In this game, you could block literally forever and nothing will happen to you. You might get thrown, but assuming that your opponent just keeps on hitting punch for the entire match, you just don't get hurt. Period. You just block and block and block someone. Eventually this might be a problem because you might get pushed to the corner and something weird might happen, but usually, no, you just keep blocking. And it's super important to realize this because the feeling of it never being your turn is an unpleasant feeling for most fighting game players. To know that your opponent can keep on doing that and you basically not be able to do anything can be frustrating, but because they have to, you have a lot of time to get calm. You have a lot of time to slow yourself down enough to go, maybe I'll eventually be able to recognize where to hold in here.
cannot lose it. Are you ready? No way!
Get ready. Fight! Get ready. Fight! Get ready. Fight!
What happened to all that spirit you had a moment ago? All right. I will do.
This is your last chance to run away. last chance to run away.
Try to hit me!
Get ready. Fight! Get ready. Fight!
Try to hit me! Try it!
Don't make me laugh.
I'll end this quickly.
Looks fun. Give it your all.
Bayman actually manages fairly well in this same situation because while he doesn't have the best speed to move in on Janli after certain things, he does have quite a lot of range on his throws, so that when Janli does miss, he can get in and grab quickly. But we still see most of the same styles of attack from before.
Get ready. Fight!
fun. Give it your all.
Now here's an interesting matchup trying to put both of those pieces of information into play at once. Momiji isn't so great at the sidestep thing, meaning Janli gets to attack head-on a lot more, but Janli also tends to miss. And he's not super slow at actually counter-attacking once given the chance, but the point is that Momiji isn't the character that gives you the chance for this. One of the most important things actually is to understand that when you created a stagger position, a situation where you have managed to keep your opponent out and just checked them a little bit, and they want to hit another button, it's really important to have a good idea what that button is, because you want to hold it. But with Momiji this is particularly difficult. As with most players who play ninjas, you just get used to the idea of, oh, well, I've just been staggered, let me hit a random button. Because of the different ways that they can convert into things, or just the fact that you're used to being beat up if you hit your most obvious one, you're much more likely to have a player who gets hit in a stagger playing Ayane, Kasumi, Momiji hit just about anything. You really don't know which of the things they're going to do. They might even try to run up and throw you. There's no way really to tell. This actually does lead to one good option, that when you've staggered your opponent, especially when you are near a wall, for nearly every character in the game, a good option, if you think your opponent is going to attack, is to just use your break hold then. This will put them on the other side of you, closer to the wall, and help to resolve your problem. You end up using some meter, but you get a fairly good advantage.
Guess I've been getting stronger.
This is particularly true for Momiji because there's nowhere for her to go. Once she's reached a wall or a corner, even her moves that move her backward don't put her out of your range anymore. And having nowhere to retreat to is kind of important for this character.
Let's see how strong you are. I'm giving this all I got.
Fight! Get ready! Fight!
here to take me out?
This is your last chance to run away.
Fight! Get ready, fight!
No way!
Get ready, fight! Get ready, fight! Get ready,
We are seeing some more of Ayane's various punches and movements in from the center this week, making that kind of a hard job for DoA6 Bayman. Because Ayane's movement using those options is so deceptive, it causes Bayman to have to attack preemptively a lot more often, but preemptive attacks from Bayman don't usually work well on Ayane in the first place. The bigger ones can lead to something useful, but they're relatively easily adapted to over time. And getting hit in the head with coconuts can't be helping.
You were acting all tough at the beginning.
She is absolutely an overwhelming character in terms of how many things you have to think about that she can do at any given time, so every time an Ayane player unlocks a new, hey, I can do this, they've just increased your strain. A lot of the time, it's almost exponential, to the point where after a while you stop thinking about what Ayane can do and just think about reacting to it in time. Oh, what's up this time? Let's see if we have broken into chaos or just a minor shift. Okay. Hard to say, but we didn't lose everyone, so I guess we're continuing at least for a bit.
I don't have time to play games with you.
Looks fun. Give it your all.
Fight!
Try to hit me. Try to hit me. Try to hit me. Try to hit me.
Get ready! Fight!
Are you ready?
Oh, I see we have a big thunderstorm rolling in, so you never know. Looks like our Janley is taking this somewhat less seriously. But that kind of makes sense given that there's no sidestepping happening.
Get ready! Fight!
But there are always things you can actually practice in these situations. It's also a strength that certain players just get totally used to the idea of not having to move at all. Because being loose like this allows you to increase your reaction time immensely and to, let's say, sense your opponent's intentions better. It's also extremely unnerving to players who expect and somewhat need their opponent to attack or to do multiple things of that type. But it looks like they get to move on.
What happened to all that spirit you had a moment ago? I will do my
this is a little harder in this stage. But in any case, if this player doesn't want to take it seriously, I guess they'll just get beat up. This is technically fine, because it does lead to some useful things. Occasionally players do join the lounge without a strong intention to fight fully. They're basically playing non-seriously and keeping health approximately even, you know, to make it a little bit harder for themselves, and because, you know, once you're holding back a little bit because it's a loser stays on lounge, and if you want to keep playing, then you have to do that. The difficulty here is usually that you have to question why you're here at all, because are you gaining anything? Are you having fun? There are definitely ways to do that though, and you can see it being shown here. Practicing things that are particularly hard for your character, for example, reacting extremely quickly at close range, or landing specific combos that are only difficult at a longer range, but you specifically try to do them from the longer range, can improve lots of your skills while still allowing you to hold back against players that might not be as strong as you. In this case, I'm not sure it's working out exactly because OmniRabbit is generally more calm and often stronger, but maybe they're about to unleash their full power. And even if not, it's still useful to do sometimes, even if you can't change yourself out of the mindset of it in time to actually get anything out of it. So when you are particularly strong against opponents, learning to read their movements or feel out what they plan to do can be a good challenge for lounges like this. And we don't generally mind this. We've had people who for some reason join and just lose, which doesn't make a lot of sense really, but I guess they're trying to prove the point that winner stays on should be the thing. I don't know. People are hard to understand sometimes, okay? But either way, this time, maybe it worked out for them, maybe it didn't. They did get in some really cool, basically instant holds and good spacing reactions, so hopefully it has been helping them out in some way. Oh, I have no idea. They're gone. So, or maybe they went into one of the other match things. You can't actually see all of the players sometimes if they are not in here, but you can see the 5 of 8. So yeah, they're gone. I don't know if it's broken again. It seems we're definitely moving toward the stage where it starts to have some problems. So we may end the stream tonight based on that. Because the opponent can be seen on one screen but not the others. If this is the current collapse of our lounge, then obviously we'll see you again. And we're down to mostly the usual suspects, assuming that this has some form of error outright. No, wait, maybe. I'm seeing something now. That said, we should probably consider it to be the end regardless, as it's not likely to get any better as we stand now. So, we'll be having our Mix and Mash Battle Lounge for Street Fighter V on Monday as always, and most likely rotate back around to another SixyTimes on Thursday. We haven't generally been having our Tuesday or Wednesday content due to lots of weird things coming up. And we don't expect it to restart all that soon. Once again, it always has been that this is around the time of year where for like 2 months, starting at the end of May, we generally stream and do things a bit less because of, as mentioned before, Combo Breaker. But it's also because this is the time when most people want stuff done and yank team members off to do all sorts of things, and sometimes streaming gets weird. So we're probably going to be staying on that until around mid-August. I will try to get maybe a Tuesday stream occasionally, especially since no one wants to get particularly rusty at the games we normally played on Tuesdays. But you may end up seeing those at other times, possibly on personal streams of team members who will happen to be practicing them. You can usually see those to reference bots more so than anything else. The bots themselves can be found at our website 2-mk.org. And depending on the game, they will be more or less helpful. The ones for this game are mainly for beginners, so we haven't put a lot of effort into developing them, mainly because once you have decided that you're going to use a bot for DoA, you can't actually have any matches or anything. I don't know how they have changed that. We should probably check if it still does that. But basically in this game, once you've committed to training, you've literally committed to training. You can't take matches and come back and the information still be there for the bot. Similar issues, though not as bad, happen in Under Night. Namely that bots are lost when you change specific things, but interestingly not necessarily when you change character. Who knows? For this reason, we have multiple bots in that game that use the same inputs, and it's relatively simplified. Fortunately, the game itself is somewhat simplified in the requirements for inputs, and it tends to work out. You'll find a lot of bots on that side share things. Street Fighter, of course, can save bots entirely per character, save them to their backup system storage and everything. And Dragon Ball does more or less the same thing, but only tends to require one input with different things. So we're now probably going to go into the last match of the night. Maybe that was an issue with the connection between these two players, or rather, Omni Rabbit and Chon Snow. So you can expect the stream to end at the end of this match. The lounge, it's hard to say. We would obviously like to keep the lounge open, but if we are having some form of problems, it will probably close. And as mentioned before, there's a bunch of stuff that comes up that needs to get done. Summer, it's just the way it is. Also hot.
No way.
All right. I will do
For some
my
of us, the suffering never ends and it's always hot, but that's another time for another time.
Get ready. Fight! Get ready. Fight!
That's a somewhat new one. But nothing to be impressed or distracted by it.
Get ready. Fight!
here we see one of the things mentioned before, but not in the actually causing the opponent to scramble part, just doing a whiff that you expect to have a specific reaction from. It can be a very effective tactic, but it mostly again depends on your opponent having a specific quick reaction that you understand and know. So it's a good final lesson to contain within this particular stream. The deciding blow, and it pushes us into one more round. The last round, if you will. With this punch, that's it for the night. Good luck with your training and good night everyone. This has been Rillian 14 2MK.